I am a practicing oncologist. I am a practicing oncologist at UCLA School of Medicine, and am proud to and happy to introduce Dr. John Carpten to you all. He currently serves as a professor and chair for the Department of Translational Genomics and is the director of the Institute of Translational Genomics at Keck School of Medicine, USC in Los Angeles. Dr. Carpten received his PhD in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology from The Ohio State University. Prior to his current appointment at USC, he served as professor and deputy director of basic sciences at the Translational Genomics Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Carpten's expertise spans a very broad range of research, including germline genetics, tumor profiling, cancer cell biology, functional genomics, and health disparities. The primary goal of Dr. Carpten's research is to discover the molecular alterations in cancer and to translate these findings into new approaches for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of cancer. In support of this goal, his programs have actively been involved in the development and application of cutting-edge technologies and novel bioinformatic approaches for discovery research. Dr. Carpten has co-authored 190 publications in scientific journals that include Science, Nature, Nature Genetics, Cancer Cell, Molecular Therapeutics, as well as in the New England Journal of Medicine. Through his leadership in the African American Hereditary Prostate Cancer Study Network, he conceived this particular study became a model for genetic studies in underrepresented populations and led to the first genome-wide scan for prostate cancer susceptibility genes in African Americans. His work has impacted our understanding of a variety of cancer types that disproportionately affects racial and ethnic minorities, including prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, brain cancer, multiple myeloma, and pediatric cancers. Dr. Carpten was named as a science trailblazer by Spectrum magazine in 2006 and was awarded the AACR and Susan G. Komen Distinguished Lectureship on the Science of Cancer Health Disparities in 2014 and the AACR Jane Cook Wright Lectureship in 2018. In ensuring that all people are equally represented in science and innovative healthcare, in 2019, he served as a program committee chair for the AACR annual conference in Atlanta, Georgia, which included over 21,000 international participants. It is his hope and his effort that will lead to improvements in cancer management and outcomes for all patients and our greater understanding of the racial disparities involved in healthcare. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carpten and look forward to everything he has to say. Dr. Carpten, over to you.
Thanks, Saul. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I probably should have included a few words at the end of this title: Cancer Health Disparities, Progress, Challenges, and Opportunities Towards the Elimination and Mitigation of these Disparities. You heard terms genetics and genomics and molecular quite a bit in that introduction. Thank you so much for those warm and kind words, Saul. But I think I'm as or even most proud of just being a community advocate, just sort of being a person who's who has an opportunity to be at the table and be involved in a lot of healthcare innovation research and just trying to ensure that everyone gets access. And it's as much a responsibility and a purpose for me as it is a career. And so hopefully some of that passion will come across in this presentation. I want to take you just sort of, on a ride, as we consider aspects related and the factors that influence what we tend to call cancer health disparities or cancer disparities. And most of you probably know or understand, essentially what we're talking about are, those indications by where we see differences in areas that might include risk, incidence rates, response to therapy, outcomes. We see these differences in individuals that might come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And then, so there's been quite a bit of research ongoing, for a number of decades now, trying to understand, the factors that influence those differences. And we've learned a lot, particularly over the last, I would say, 12 to 15 years, that, of course, as one would expect, these things are caused by, sort of a multifactorial collection of factors. And I've had the privilege, right, to have participated in a lot of this work and help design some of the studies. Also, I had the opportunity to lead the development of a cancer health disparities progress report, and I'll talk quite a bit about that. And some of the slides that I'll show actually come from that report. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, because I think it's a great resource as you go away from this presentation. If you want, that additional reading material to get more insights and more details, it'll be provided through that document. So, as we think about cancer disparities at a glance, as we think about those differences in burden, just a few facts, right? This isn't all of it. This is just a few facts. As we think about African-American men having 111% and 39% higher risk of dying from prostate and breast cancer, or Hispanic children and adolescents being 20 and or 38% more likely to develop leukemia or suffer from complications, where we see Asian Pacific Islander adults being twice as likely to die from gastric cancer or stomach cancer, or American Indian and Alaskan Native adults being twice as likely to develop liver or bile duct cancer compared to whites, right? So these are just a few of the examples as we think about sort of this whole aspect of cancer disparities. I love to throw this one. This is a punch to the gut that I really like to throw out there. Eliminating disparities has far-reaching implications. Of course, the number one reason is to ensure that everyone is as healthy as they can possibly be, but it has an incredible financial impact as well, by where research has shown that eliminating disparities, if we had considered the years 2003, 2006, would have reduced the direct medical costs by $250 million, and indirect costs associated with illness and premature death from these disparities of over $1 trillion, right? So the impact of mitigating these disparities is far-reaching. As we consider, African Americans here in the States are Blacks, and a lot of these statistics come from the American Cancer Society. They put out a cancer statistics report every year. And I would say over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, they put out a cancer statistics report that focuses on African Americans and Blacks in the US, and looking at cancer incidence and death rates for Black men and women. We see some of the common cancers such as prostate, lung, colorectal, breast, uterine cancer, and then as we consider deaths, lung, prostate, colon in men, lung, breast, and colon in women. Pancreatic cancer is also on the rise in the Black population here in the US. Another way we look at these disparities is through what ACS calculates as a rate ratio, which is sort of a ratio of the rates, cancer rates, as we consider Blacks versus whites here in the US. And again, here looking at incidence rates. So these are cancer rates, the development of cancer or the rates of cancer across individual populations. Looking at essentially the rate per 100,000 individuals. And the higher this number, of course, the higher the disparity. And we see Kaposi sarcoma, which is an AIDS-related malignancy, at the top of the list as we consider cancer rates between Blacks and whites. And then we start to see a few other tumor types that aren't as common. So cancers such as multiple myeloma, gastric cancer, liver cancer, in men, and myeloma, stomach and liver cancer, and cervical cancer in women. And then as we look at death rates, again, not the really the more common forms of cancer, of course, prostate cancer in men, but we see stomach cancer, throat cancer, multiple myeloma, gastric and liver and cholangiocarcinoma, bile duct cancer. These cancers that aren't so common, we don't hear about them as much. But they have really, really significant increases in their rates when you compare Blacks versus whites. And again, these data represent death rates. Now, again, without a doubt, these disparities are caused and influenced by a number of factors. And I think in most cases we can sort of categorize them into two sort of main areas as we think about the social construct of society or societal related issues as we consider race. And that's where race comes into play in terms of society and social construct. And again, over the past probably 15 years or so, we've learned so much more about sort of genetic components of yeah, if you can all mute, that would be great. As we think of biology and genetics and considering genetic ancestry. So many of you have heard about Ancestry.com and 23andMe, where you send a sample of your I think it's usually saliva, and they can utilize genetic markers and give you at least a really good representation of your ancestral genetic makeup, your ancestral proportions, based on what we consider sort of populations, sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Asia, and Native American. And so we have to, and the interesting thing is that these two things are not necessarily independent of each other. There's an interplay between race and society and genetic ancestry. In terms of genetic ancestry, in many cases, individuals who share phenotypes, as we think about African Americans, right? How African Americans, assimilate and congregate within community and around culture, again, which is related to this racial component. And so these two things interact. And I think as we consider the social and we consider race, there are a lot of things to consider, and I'll walk through some of those concepts later on in the presentation. But just this whole idea of the social stressors and the impact that has in various communities, and how that influences our physiology, right? And that physiology is going to be manifest upon a very specific sort of biology that's been tuned by natural selection, which is your genetic ancestry. Right, and so these two things sort of interact in a really complex way, and has a real important impact on, as we consider cancer, the cancers themselves, the tumors, as well as the host, right? How the cancer develops, how aggressively the cancer develops, how likely that cancer will respond to various types of treatments. And so considering all of these concepts around race and society, as well as biology, as we consider the factors that influence these disparities. Again, as we think about race and we think about sort of the social determinants of health, and we think about things like identity, we think about socioeconomics and poverty, and we think about the built environment, the structural racism, that is manifest here in the United States, undoubtedly, over the last several hundred years. Again, and the impact of this social construct on physiology and biology as we think about disease risk, for instance, as we think about cancer risk and cancer outcomes. But again, as mentioned, over the last 12 to 15 years, we've learned a lot about the genetic ancestry, and we understand that various groups and various racial groups and populations have geographic location, but we also know that there's been things like migration, right? Voluntary migration and also forced migration, as we think about the transatlantic slave trade, where many West Africans were forcefully translocated to other regions of the world in support of slavery. And with that has come sort of these really interesting mixtures where we consider, for instance, African Americans. If you were to look at the genetic ancestry of many individuals, for instance, from Nigeria, they may have 97% or greater African genetic ancestry. However, when you look at African Americans, there's this interesting admixture that has occurred over the last several hundred years through cross relationships, particularly with Europeans, so that now we have more, when we consider African Americans, we really have this what we call admixed population. That is a population that has genetic ancestry components that include African as well as European, and in some cases others such as Native American or Asian, and how this biology, this underlying biology, can influence disease risk across these admixed populations. And again, this is an interesting graph where we can look at each one of these little dots represents an individual, and the way these dots cluster together means that those individuals have similar genetic ancestry. And you can see these red or brown dots at the sort of top right quadrant are individuals from Nigeria, right? And interestingly, you could see the group down here in green where it says Utah resident Seth, which are representative of Northern and Western European ancestry. And then when we look at African Americans, and I apologize for the color coding here, but as we think about Americans of African ancestry or African Americans, you see this gradient of individuals, for instance, these light blue dots that are kind of similar to individuals from Nigeria, but then those who are more admixed with European admixture, where you have some who are likely have as much as 75 to 80% European genetic ancestry, but consider themselves African American. And so on a census or on a form that may request information on race, they may put down African American, but have upwards of 80% European admixture. One interesting example of identity is Rachel Dolezal, the lady from Washington State, who was the president of her local NAACP chapter, and essentially lived the vast majority of her adult life as an African-American woman. And upon, sort of physical, just physically, darker skin and, wore, more African-related hairstyles, and had lived her adult life as an African-American woman, but later found out that she had 4 European grandparents. And so from the standpoint of her genetic ancestry, she's essentially European, but lives her life culturally as an African-American woman. So this whole concept of race and identity and who am I and how do I define myself versus utilizing information from our actual genetic ancestry to understand these things so that we can better understand the role of race versus the role of biology in these disparities. And we've begun to apply these concepts as we're trying to understand the proportion of race versus biology in these disparities. In considering race and ancestry in biology, race, of course, can be associated with biology or phenotype as we consider socioeconomics and financial toxicities and healthcare costs. Access to quality healthcare can impact our sort of physical traits and our particularly as we think about how healthy or unhealthy we are. The healthcare patient interface, the built environment, and cultural diet and lifestyle. And of course, genetic ancestry can also be associated with biology and phenotype. And one of I would say the poster child for this is sickle cell anemia. And I think it's also a really interesting example of where we could use the word disease or the word condition. Right, and I think those two words can have different overall connotations to some degree. So sickle cell was a trait that sort of arose in individuals who lived in heavy malaria infected areas. So areas that had high malaria infestation. Of course, malaria is a parasite that can lead to death. And so in these regions that had high levels of malaria, individuals would get infected and die. So at some point in human history, an individual who lived in one of those areas acquired a mutation that happened in the hemoglobin gene, and it changed the shape of the red blood cells. So malaria's mechanism of action is to attack red blood cells. But because of this mutation, the red blood cells took the shape of a sickle or a crescent moon, and the malaria parasites could not infect those types of red blood cells. So individuals who had that mutation could essentially live to the age of reproduction because they would not be impacted by malaria infection. Now you take that same group of people and you move them out into an area where there's no malaria. Now all of a sudden they have a disease that's called sickle cell anemia, right? And so this whole concept of a condition versus a disease, sickle cell anemia to me is a condition. It's a condition of that phenotype in a specific environment. But it's a great example of how genetics it can influence biology. Hypertension is another interesting example, as it's believed that many of the Africans who survived the transatlantic slave trade had to be able to retain water because they weren't given fresh water. And so as many of the individuals who didn't have that trait might have died off during the Middle Passage, many of those individuals who did have that trait to retain water were able to survive the trip and are the ancestors of many of modern day African Americans. And so it's believed that that whole concept of retaining water, right, which leads to increased blood pressure, is strongly associated. So you have that biology and that phenotype, that genetic trait. And interestingly, I'm hypertensive. I was diagnosed, I believe, back in 1994, 95. And interestingly, as soon as the doctor realized I was hypertension, I remember her saying, well, since you're African American, we're going to give you a drug that includes a diuretic because it's probably due to water retention. And I'm one of those lucky African Americans where it actually did work. But I heard a presentation from another person, Charles Rotimi, who's an investigator at the National Institutes of Health, who's African, who also is hypertensive. But the diuretic didn't work. It actually, he had an adverse reaction to that particular type of medicine, where a doctor used race as a way to think about an approach to treating his hypertension, but it was wrong. The approach was the wrong approach. So we have to be a little bit careful about that and perhaps use more molecular-based biomarkers to make those decisions. And of course, cancer being that other biology or phenotype that can be associated with genetic ancestry. So I want to walk through a couple of examples as we think about race and how race can influence outcome. Without a doubt, we know that socioeconomics and access to private insurance and access to healthcare are huge contributors to cancer disparities. It's been shown that 10% of African Americans and 18% of Hispanics were uninsured compared to only 5% of non-Hispanic whites in the US. As we consider treatment disparities in cancer treatment that are associated with, for instance, patients with this form of bile duct cancer who are African American were 50% less likely to get surgery compared to patients who are white. And a lot of this has to do with socioeconomics and access to care. Really an interesting example, this was a study done by investigators at the American Cancer Society. And it's related to B-cell lymphoma, which is a form of blood cancer, cancer of the white blood cells. Interestingly, back in 2001, there was a novel blockbuster drug that was developed called rituximab, and it's a targeted therapy. And when added to standard chemotherapy, it significantly increased complete response rates and overall survival in patients with B-cell lymphoma, right? So here you have this blockbuster drug, right? So any patient with lymphoma should probably get this drug because it's going to work really, really well. However, when they looked at patients and they looked at clinical databases between 2001 and 2004, it showed that there was a significant trend in the increased disparity in who got rituximab, by where results indicated that disparities existed in the receipt of recommended chemo and rituximab being an immunotherapy, where Blacks and uninsured and individuals with Medicaid insured patients had lower odds of receiving rituximab. So here you can see African Americans, and then here you can see individuals who were uninsured were much less likely to get this added to their treatment, right? So this is a clear indicator of how socioeconomics, access to care can impact clinical outcomes. Because if individuals had access to these therapies, they probably would have outcomes and response rates similar to their white peers. And as we think about ancestry, so biology, and I know everyone always wants to correlate disparities with race and inequality, and of course, it plays a huge role. But we're learning so much more about the impact of biology and genetic ancestry. And one of the most amazing examples was a study done out of St. Jude's. June Yang actually is going to be presenting at my master's in my master's degree course on genetic diversity and human disease next Wednesday. And Mary Relling performed this study, a pharmacogenomic study, in children with relapse acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And just, I think it's important to note that most kids who get leukemia have a pretty good outcome. However, there are ethnic differences in survival where you see poor overall survival among African American kids and those kids that tend to identify with Hispanic ethnicity. It's also important to understand how many of these children are treated. There's an induction chemotherapy, consolidation, intensification, and maintenance. And then some kids will get what's called delayed intensification, where there's another really, really high dose of chemo before they go into low dose maintenance therapy. And so the research team at St. Jude's actually took a large group of children that had been diagnosed with leukemia and had been treated. They were able to collect their data, and they genotyped. So they performed genetic ancestry analysis on over 2,500 children. So they knew the genetic ancestral proportions for each child. And this figure is a way to look at it. And one way to think about it is, if you look sort of top to bottom, each one of the children represents a very, very thin line. And red is indicative of European genetic ancestry. So the kids that fall into this sort of region over to the right have very, very high rates of European ancestry, going from 0 to 100. The gray is African ancestry. So these children here with gray would typically be considered African American or individuals of West African ancestry. So you can see there's an admixture, there's mixture between European and African ancestry in these children. Green is Asian, and then blue is Native American. So there's a really interesting sort of diversity, genetic diversity within this particular cohort of children. And so what they then went on to do was to correlate genetic ancestry with various clinical correlates from their EMR. And amazingly, what they found was that children that had greater than 10% Native American ancestry had a much higher probability of relapse after treatment. So, and what was really astounding was even the children that self-reported as white, that had greater than 10% Native American ancestry, had a significantly higher probability of relapse after treatment. So it seemed like in the study, there was this really interesting correlation between Native American ancestry and therapeutic response or lack thereof. Now, interestingly, they were also able to look at kids who got different types of treatment regimen. And when they looked at the kids that did not receive delayed intensification before maintenance, they saw this clear disparity. However, when they looked at all the kids who did get delayed intensification, they could eliminate the disparity. And so this is just, I think, to me, it's one of the most amazing studies ever done in disparities, because what it shows is that there's a link, what seems to be a biological link between genetic ancestry and response to therapy, but that you can mitigate that particular disparity by modifying the treatment regimen. So if a child comes into the clinic with greater than 10% Native American ancestry, perhaps those children should all get delayed intensification as part of their treatment regimen. So just amazing study, and is one of a number of studies that have been published over the last 10 or so years that have been able to link genetic ancestry to tumor alterations or clinical outcomes in patients that are otherwise underrepresented minorities that are associated with cancer disparities. As we think about some of the other factors, I think, as we think about preventable risk factors and disparities, one interesting example is lung cancer. If we look at the trends in death rates for lung cancers, we look at male and female, we see this incredible increase in death rates among African-American men compared to white men. And we don't really see that disparity in Black women. And then we can consider some of the data that we have on smoking. For instance, smoking rates are higher among African-American men compared to non-Hispanic white men, but lower among African-American women. So some of these preventable risk factors actually may be influencing some of the disparities that we're seeing. Also, African-American adults and children are more likely to be exposed to secondhand smoke compared to their white peers or individuals from other racial and ethnic groups. So we also have to consider these sort of modifiable preventable risk factors and their possible or likely role in many of the disparities that we see. I think obesity and physical activity represent, another class of preventable risk factors as we consider, for instance, obesity rates across racial and ethnic groups. We see that African Americans, especially African American women, have much higher obesity rates compared to women from other racial and ethnic groups. And obesity happens to be associated with postmenopausal breast cancer rates. And so again, these preventable risk factors, are there things that we can do to modify modify these preventable risk factors that could help to mitigate some of the disparities that we see across various tumor types as we consider underrepresented racial minorities. Pathogens is another one, and it's a big one, especially as we consider HPV, right? We think about HPV rates and cervical cancer, head and neck cancer, and we consider, as we think about Hispanics compared to African Americans and incidence of cervical cancer, and we know that importantly, there's a vaccine, right, for cervical cancer. So what are the things that we can do to increase cervical HPV vaccinations in underrepresented minority communities such as Hispanic, Latino communities, and African American communities that could help mitigate some of the disparities that we see in these cancers that might be driven by pathogens such as HPV. And so some of the other challenges and opportunities, I think, one of the, in areas of intense focus in biomedical research and clinical research right now is trying to work towards more inclusion and greater diversity and representation in clinical trials. A great example is prostate cancer. We know that prostate cancer incidence rates are nearly twofold higher among African American men, and death rates are 2 to 3-fold higher as well, right? So we have this, very, very historic cancer disparity that has persisted for decades. However, when we look at clinical trial representation for two large clinical trials for prostate cancer, and these were drugs that were ultimately approved, we can see that the representation of individuals within these trials were upwards of 70 to 80% European descent men. And in many cases, less than 5% African Americans. So this is a huge area of again, intense focus. Both the FDA, the pharmaceutical community, biomedical research, academic healthcare systems is trying to figure out what we can do to increase diversity in clinical trials, because the overall efficacy and toxicity profiles that are being utilized to create the labels for these drugs are based on largely European clinical trial cohorts. And it's not until after the drug has been approved and used for the care of cancer patients that we're starting to see that the efficacy and/or the toxicity profiles may actually be different when we consider individuals, for instance, of higher African descent or Latino descent. So just in closing, and just to summarize, cancer disparities are caused, again, by a number of factors. And again, I believe a lot of the work that's been done over the last 20 or 30 years has really allowed us to hone in on some of these factors, especially the biological components. We must address the social determinants of healthcare inequality, and structural racism. That is undoubtedly the foundation of the disparities that we see in cancer rates, and particularly cancer outcomes among underrepresented minority individuals. We also must make cancer care more affordable and available to all people. And I know there's legislation that's constantly moving back and forth across the aisle to try to provide, that type of access to, to care, right? To provide affordable health care to all people. We also must continue to understand the biological components related to population genetics and ancestry to identify those possible mechanisms of risk towards developing markers for early detection and interception. One of the things that we know is early detection saves lives. So if we can come up with innovative ways of utilizing this genetic ancestry information in terms of understanding risk, who's at likely higher risk, can we use that information to come up with new and better ways to detect these cancers early? If so, and get those patients into care, we can possibly improve outcomes and reduce some of these disparities. And then finally, we have to continue to work to diversify clinical trials and diversify our cohorts in our biomedical research studies, as well as access to healthcare innovations through community engagement and bidirectional education and dialogue between the community and the healthcare system. So again, I just wanted to walk through some of the causes and some of the factors that influence and drive these disparities. And for me, the fun part of presentations is always the Q&A session where we get to dialogue and chat a bit about some of the concepts and some of the perspective that I shared today. So thank you for your attention. And finally, I do want to point you to this, this report, this document that was produced by the American Association for Cancer Research, and this was commissioned by Congress, the development of this Cancer Disparities Progress Report. This was the inaugural report that was presented to Congress in September of 2020 towards achieving the bold vision of health equity for racial and ethnic minorities and other underserved populations. I had the pleasure to serve as the chair for the steering committee for the development of this document. If you go to the AACR website, American Association for Cancer Research, you can find this document there, or you can just Google Cancer Disparities Progress Report, AACR, and you'll find the link. And I would encourage everyone to, if you have the time, download the document. There are a ton of details, greater detail into what we know about cancer disparities, the progress that's been made, the gaps that still exist, and some of the opportunities and some of the initiatives that are currently underway to help us mitigate and hopefully eliminate these disparities in the not too distant future. So thanks again for your attention, and I'd be happy to address or answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? I guess there are a couple of ways to do this. One is to use the chat. And I do see at least one question in the chat box. That's a good way to do it. I guess the other way is to utilize the raise your hand. And so, I'll address this one question in the chat. It says, thank you, Dr. Carpten. What are some of the main reasons there's less representation in clinical trials from African Americans and other minorities? And what can or is being done to increase participation? It's a great question. I think it's probably a number of factors. We can point to, I think, the disconnect between many of the large academic health centers that many of the large definitive clinical trials are performed at. As we think in cancers, we think about many of the large academic cancer centers. Unfortunately, those cancer centers don't serve these underrepresented minority communities. Many of the individuals who are diagnosed with cancer in those communities will be referred to community oncology clinics that are not necessarily tethered to these cancer centers. I know there's been a concerted effort by a number of the large academic cancer centers to partner, and some are even acquiring some of these hospitals and some of these oncology clinics to gain better access to the community to help in increasing diversity and representation in clinical trials. I think another one is just overall community education, engagement, and that overall mistrust of biomedical research, due in at least part to some of the historical atrocities, Henrietta Lacks scenario. So we think about the Tuskegee experiment, some of those things that sit in the back of the minds of a lot of individuals, and prevents individuals from wanting to participate in clinical trials. Now, it really depends on who you ask. There have been a number of studies that show that trust is not as big of an issue as we think sometimes, that individuals are interested in participating. They just want to know more. They want to understand what it is they're getting themselves into, and would be happy to participate if given the opportunity. I know that some of the initiatives underway, there has been a concerted effort for patient navigation programs and platforms to navigate patients through the system. I also think that the pharmaceutical companies are now really getting behind this. A number of pharmaceutical companies have invested in offices and programs to work with the academic community as well as the lay community to identify those barriers and to come up with ways to overcome those barriers and improve inclusion in clinical trials. So a lot of things are underway now. We've actually lifted this up as the #1 priority for cancer disparities research for the next 5 to 10 years, is to work towards significantly increasing diversity in clinical trials. About a month ago, I even saw some draft legislation that might be moving its way through to actually, strongly encourage NIH funding, right, to be tied to diversification of these clinical trials. And I think it's going to take that type of effort for us to, because at the end of the day, many trials are accrued, they want to accrue fast, right, because you're trying to get to an approval, right? And if they have to go above and beyond what they typically do, then it slows down the approach, the process, and in many cases, you hear it introduces inefficiencies and slows down the process, right? And pharmaceutical companies don't want that, right? They want to get the drug approved as fast as possible. But I think they're all starting to really get behind this and understand that there's a lot to be gained by diversifying clinical trials. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, my hope is that we'll see significant increases in diversity in clinical trials. I see another question. Any correlation or info relative to the environment and or ingredients and products that are unsafe or banned in other countries? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. I do believe, but I think there's still quite a bit we need to learn about the relationship between those environmental factors and specifically to cancer disparities. I think I almost would flip this on its head a little bit, and probably, say that it's probably a lack of access to more healthy things and a more healthy environment that's probably influencing these disparities, right? As we think about geocoding, as we think about food deserts, as we think about what we call the built environment, right? And the social stressors, right, that impact individuals, who live in these poor communities, right, poverty-stricken communities, and the impact of that environment on their physiology, and how that actually can lay the bed for, if a cancer develops, right, that cancer is developing in a system that's already broken, right, because of these pressures. For instance, chronic inflammation, right, and how that can drive aggressive cancer growth. So it's a complicated question. I'm not quite sure if I would say it's linked specifically to cancer disparities. I do believe that it's linked to cancer, but I think that it's more a lack of access to healthier environments that's influencing some of these disparities. I see another comment, somewhat of a question. Says, my husband is a prostate cancer doctor and says some men have told him they wouldn't join a trial because of the Tuskegee experiment. Yes, these historical atrocities. And, it's interesting, I think part of that is who individuals tend to get their information from. So I did a TEDx talk a couple years ago. The title of the talk was Miss Daisy, the Deacon and the Doctor, and how Miss Daisy was sort of the church, very, she's a, deaconess, she's, and where is she going to get her information if she happens to be diagnosed with breast cancer, right? A lot of individuals, especially older individuals, will put more trust, right, in their faith-based community than they will the healthcare community. And I remember once walking behind a lady, and this is kind of where that TED Talk was conceived from. And the lady was telling the deacon that, she had lymphoma and they were, wanted to put her on a clinical trial. And he said, don't let them experiment on you. And I was probably about 10 feet behind them. I wasn't eavesdropping, but I couldn't help but overhear it. And it just broke my heart because the first person she went to ask was a deacon and not me, right? Who's another church member that she knows who does biomedical research in cancer. And so I think a lot of it also has to do with where we get the information. And so this whole aspect of community outreach, community engagement, about a week and a half ago, and we're not the only ones who've done it, but along with folks from Charles Drew, we held a COVID vaccine event for the community in South LA. And so many people were uninformed about vaccines. And it was just so amazing to see after that meeting that people were saying that they were scheduling their vaccines, right? Because they were getting the right information from the right people. And so I think, as we consider this mistrust, I think it has a lot to do with us being more open. And I think one of the slides, I talked about that bi-directional education and community. We need to listen to the community, and we need to learn from them as much as we expect them to learn from us. Another question, do you think obesity is more genetic or educational factor in regards to breast cancer with Hispanic and Black women, for instance, white women too? My guess is it's probably a little bit of both. I think that there are likely, again, when I talk about genetic ancestry, I'm almost talking about that natural selection, right? The way genomes have been tuned for our ancestral populations to survive and thrive in the environments where they were living. And when you take individuals from those areas and transplant them to other areas, some of those traits that were beneficial, I use sickle cell as an example, are now detrimental, right? And so my guess is that the obesity issues are probably a little bit of both. They're genetic, but undoubtedly the environment, the diet, the exercise, the physical activity issues, I think play a huge role in the obesity issues that we're seeing, and those obesity issues that are specifically leading to issues like breast cancers. We know, obesity leads to issues, hormonal imbalances, and the secretion of mitogens into the bloodstream, and those mitogens are food for cancers, right? And so we know that there's a link between obesity and cancer, but what's causing the obesity? And it's likely a combination of issues related to sort of the underlying genetic ancestry of individuals, as well as the behaviors and some of these preventable risk factors that I talked about. There's another comment. It looks, thank you so much. It says the Tower Foundation for Organizing. So informative. Do you have any data regarding or suggestions for those of us who provide mental health support to cancer survivors? How can we utilize this information you've shared today to most effectively support our clientele? That's a tremendous question. I encourage you to download that AACR progress report. There's an entire section on cancer disparities and survivorship. It includes information on palliative care, mental health components. So I would encourage you to go there, and you'll get a ton of information and some amazing references as well that'll allow you to dig even deeper into these concepts. I think overall, mental health is a huge issue in many underrepresented minority communities, and is definitely one of those things that prevents individuals from getting access to quality health care. And so there's undoubtedly a link there. In terms of cancer survivorship, we know that there are disparities in survivorship, disparities in palliative care as well. But there's a ton of information in that progress report. So please feel free to pull that document down and give it a read. It says, besides educating ourselves, what kind of engagement can the average person working in the healthcare and wellness arena take part in to help move towards equality? I would say if you're working in the healthcare system, it doesn't matter, whether you're a nurse, a doc, it doesn't matter. There are usually group meetings and opportunities to, hold events to partner with other other groups within the healthcare system to put on events. And I would strongly encourage you to do that, whether they're survivorship events, events on, and they're individuals like me and other, biomedical researchers and healthcare professionals that would love to participate in those types of events. So I would say if you're working in the field, find opportunities to work with and engage your peers and your colleagues to put on events that could engage the community, support groups, events like this, inviting individuals, spreading the word, right? When you hear about these types of events, putting out flyers to provide individuals an opportunity to better engage with the biomedical research community and the healthcare system. So I think that to me is one of the things that folks within the system can do. So I think that's it in terms of the questions. And
I know that you need to run off and carry on with your evening. So I wanted to say on behalf of Tara Cancer Research Foundation that we're so grateful that you were able to share your knowledge and wisdom and experience with us. We had a huge turnout. It was great. It was a great opportunity to do exactly what you said, which is share the education with others and spread the word. I know we have some board members on, Jeannie and Donna, and we're grateful for what you do on our board now and being able to present this really important information to our community.
yeah, I think as we look at where we are, I think the cancer rates, death rates went down. I think Otis Brawley, when he was president of ACS, 26% since the inception of the war on cancer back in the early 70s. And so progress has been made, but when we look at the individuals who are still not doing well, right, that burden, right, falls heavily upon sort of underrepresented minority communities and the medically underserved. And so for us to really make that next dent, right, in improving cancer outcomes, this area has to be addressed.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you for your attention, and really excited about the work that Tower is doing, and look forward to next steps.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpten.
Thank you. You all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Happy
you.
Black History Month.
Yes.
Yes.